we really aim to open our doors to anyone and everyone. People are always welcome to our prayer services, to the activities that we run. We aim to be not just a center that serves Orthodox Jews, which is in a way our core constituency, but that is a home to anyone who's seeking spiritually. Maybe this isn't ideal, but it happens to be that our Sabbath and holiday services are much better attended than our weekday services, and so the main sanctuary, you'll see when we go in, is a much larger prayer space, and for economical reasons and green reasons, it's not worth really using that space, although it's a majestic and wonderful prayer space, but it's not economically worthwhile to use that space during the week, so we have a smaller space. And even just from a prayer perspective, you want a room that's well matched to the turnout so that it feels full and intimate at the same time. So I wish that these chairs were all filled during the week, but they're also not, but this is just a smaller space. Many synagogues, if you visit them, will have a main sanctuary and then other chapels or smaller prayer spaces. Basically, I would define Orthodoxy as a traditional observance of the laws as given to Moses at Sinai and as developed over the generations. So Orthodoxy is a profoundly diverse community. There's nothing monolithic about Orthodoxy. One could suggest that Hasidic practice is a separate community. I would call it a sub-community of Orthodoxy. If Orthodoxy is sort of the traditionally observant community with the least or slowest paced evolution or development or incorporation of secular practices or ideas, then Hasidic practice sort of falls broadly under the definition of Orthodoxy. And some people would call it ultra-Orthodoxy. Hasidic communities tend to be geographic communities that were transported from their roots in Eastern Europe. The Hasidic culture is a culture that evolved as being based around a sort of cult would be too strong a word, but the community rabbi was the central figure, and the rabbi was not only the decisor of Jewish law, but also really offered people instruction about a broader, realm of daily life. Everyone turned to the rabbi for advice. The rabbi might tell you who to vote for. It was sort of a very strong authoritarian figure, and the community developed around that rabbi of the town, or of the neighborhood, or of the region. And as communities migrated from Europe, when they came to the New World, so for example, America or Israel, they sort of followed their rabbi or the generations of descendants of that rabbi, and they would settle in more closed insular communities, either around the descendants of the original rabbi, or even in the absence of the rabbi, sort of around the teachings and culture of their own sub-community that developed. And even their dress reflects the dress of their forebears in Eastern Europe in the 19th century. So that's the community that you see more with black coats and different kinds of black hats, fur hats or top hats, and garb like that. And they sort of fall in the ultra-Orthodox, I guess is one term that's used to describe them. And there is an even more sort of insular, internally focused community. The divider down the middle of the room separates men and women. We do have gender separation for our prayer services. Pretty much every other program that happens in this space is mixed, and our prayers are mixed participation, but the seating is separate. And you'll also notice that the leaders table is here. Most of the service is led by men. As an open and aiming to be a progressive and liberal Orthodox community, we're always struggling with that tension. Our community, when it comes to prayer space, is not fully egalitarian. And that's a direction that many of the people in the synagogue are oriented towards. But Jewish law, in its Orthodox conception, moves at a glacial pace. And so it's something that takes time and a lot of thinking to try to get there. The reason in prayer space there is gender separation is because of a sense of, in general, gender roles. There are sort of tasks assigned for women and tasks assigned for men. And in a most traditional Orthodoxy, women rarely even came to the synagogue because they were thought of as at home, taking care of the family, and in the sort of private sphere, and men acted in the public sphere. And so it wasn't even common for women to be in synagogue. But because of that strong sort of sense of division, so therefore in a prayer space also there is separation. In our community, really the prayer space is one of the only places where there continues to be gender separation, and that's part of why it creates tension in our community, because men and women are in the social sphere and the professional sphere full equals, and so sort of the question is, why do we maintain this here? It's something we struggle with. That could be a longer conversation, but I don't think it's as germane to the work that you're doing. So in the most traditional households, children will grow up within their home as siblings. They'll certainly play together. But in traditional and ultra-Orthodox families, you'll see, on Sabbath when people gather for meals, there can't even be separate tables. Kids will play together, but in traditional schools and ultra-Orthodox schools, and even in modern Orthodox schools, genders are separated for schooling from, in some places from the very beginning, separate classes even in preschool. And so there's a notion of gender separation and distinctiveness that pervades, even in the modern Orthodox community, because we have it in our prayer space, there is this notion of gender separation, and it has, let's say just a word about this, it certainly has a range of consequences, and one is in the area of sexuality. There is a sort of a complicated sexuality just because there's almost an exoticization of the other because they're separate so much. And so you may encounter students who just don't speak much to members of the other sex, and so if they're now suddenly in a setting which is a mixed setting, it can be new and challenging for them. Gender separation includes restrictions on touch between men and women, and so you may see this to some degree with the children you interact with. You'll definitely potentially see it with parents, although this is a modern Orthodox phenomenon. In a professional setting, I'll shake hands, comfortably with men and women. But even within our own congregation, you'll find people who don't touch cross-gender. So it's something to keep in mind. If you're meeting parents of Orthodox children, you may not want to initially extend your hand to a member of the opposite sex. Maybe you want to ask them, do you shake hands? And you can figure out how to negotiate that comfortably. But at the very least, if you put out your hand and there's a hesitation or a non-reciprocity to an offered hand of an Orthodox parent, you may understand that that's because the cultural norm is for men and women not to touch each other. Obviously, spouses, of course, and within families, more practiced, but outside of that, not. In modern Orthodoxy, the education is essentially the same. As you move towards, I guess what we say, to the right, towards a more ultra-Orthodox or traditional practice, then there is some differentiation because it goes back to the gender roles question. If a woman is expected to be more of a homemaker, then it's considered to be less essential for her to learn some of the nuances of Jewish law that don't apply to home life. And whereas men are trained more towards extensive Torah study and maybe even rabbinic leadership, so they're going to learn more extensive Jewish law. So the Jewish studies curricula are different for boys and girls the more you move towards the ultra-Orthodox. In the modern Orthodox school in our community, the curricula are the same. One of the strict elements of observance is the laws of keeping kosher, which basically have a couple of components. The core parts are separation of meat products and milk products, even with actually a waiting period after eating meat and before eating milk products, which ranges depending on actually your family of origin and your country of origin. 3 hours up to 6 hours, which means that an observant Jewish child in your school who, I don't know what the restrictions or rules about what kinds of things kids can and can't eat, or hot lunch, etc., but assuming kids are bringing their own lunches, I imagine in a public school setting the observant children will bring their own lunches because the hot lunch is probably not going to be certified kosher for them. So, for example, if a kid has something, a meat lunch, if they bring a hamburger or cold cuts for lunch, then if there's an ice cream snack that happens to be offered in school, they wouldn't necessarily be able to eat it for 3 or up to 6 hours. So separation of meat and milk. And it also, again, without knowing what the details of any specific school setting are, certainly I remember in school there was a culture of trading snacks and things like that. And so this is actually a significant point. A kosher-keeping child would likely not be able to eat many of the snacks that any other child in school would have. And so that's something just to keep an eye out for as it affects their interactions. Things are being traded on the table. Well, I can't have that. And I think actually challenging for some kids is how to negotiate that. And it's actually a space of conflict for children. Well, listen, maybe this isn't kosher, maybe I wouldn't eat it in my home, but I don't want to be left out, so maybe I will have it. And will I tell my parents or will I not tell my parents? It's something to keep an eye out for. These are time periods which are, potentially students are not going to attend school, but they also are not going to be able to do their homework during that time.